Hello, friends. Welcome to the Logistics of Logistics podcast. My name is Joe Lynch. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today's topic is supply chain reset, overcoming pharma and healthcare supply chain challenges with my friend Michael Needham. How's it going, Michael?
Thank you, Joe. It's going well. It's nice and hot here on the East Coast, hot and humid.
Yeah, we just got rid of that here in the Midwest. Michael, please introduce yourself and your company and where you're calling from today.
Yeah, so I'm Michael Needham. I work for a company called Efficio Consulting, based out of their New York office. We're a global procurement and supply chain consultancy. So we specialize solely in them verticals, procurement and supply chain. We work across private equity, big corporate clients, and also the public sector. And what we do for companies is we give them that real value creation at speed. So companies often ask us is, how do we run quicker, faster, and cheaper, and also keep in line on our strategy?
Yeah, so one more time, that name is Efficio. How do you spell that?
Efficio.
And so you guys are a consultancy and you work mostly in supply chain and procurement. Please describe what you guys are doing within supply chain and procurement.
Yeah, so for each client, we tailor the solution to their specific needs. So a couple of live programs that I'm leading out on at the moment. One, for example, is a manufacturing organization with 26 different locations, and they came out of financial distress and we helped them through that process. And now they're moving forward into sort of potentially M&A activity. So help them survive, stabilize them, and now building that growth platform coming out of it. Another one, for example, is a global organization with operations across North America, Europe, and Asia. And this is a company which is a big corporate headquarters, brought together multiple businesses, and their objective is to make it one company. So different manufacturing locations, different cultures, different processes, different suppliers. Our role is to simplify, release the value, and make it more connected.
Yeah, Michael, so many people in my listening to my podcast are logistics guys. And I come from the supply chains, originally automotive supply chain. And sometimes I feel like the big supply chain moves don't recognize what's happening on the logistics end, and the logistics guys don't recognize what's happening. And I will guess one way to look at it is logistics is the tail, supply chain's the dog. But it's important that we both understand what the other wants and needs. And right now we're in a weird time because we know, not just because the Trump administration was going on well before that, supply chains were repositioning. We all got a sense that our supply chains are a little more brittle than we liked during COVID. Still, it wasn't your great-grandparents' pandemic. We all gained weight as opposed to losing weight. Those who didn't suffer losses, it wasn't awful. But it's different now. Ever since COVID, there's been a slump in logistics, and on the supply chain side, lots of things going on, lots of mergers and acquisitions, lots of, I'll say, China plus one, where they're saying, do we want to be overly dependent on China? People are saying, does my supply chain need to be back in the US or in Europe or Mexico or Canada? It's a strange time.
It is, but I'll just say on that one, Joe, it's always a strange time. So even if you think about the last 2 months, there's been various disruptions. And you look back the last 2 years, there's a lot. And then before that, it was the pandemic. So disruption in supply chain is pretty much a given. So that's what I teach our consultants is expect something to go wrong, because that's the normal setting. And I want to clarify one of your points you said about the logistics and supply chain. So logistics will be the tail. I'd slightly take a bit more of a strategic view on logistics, and it helps the pipe move through. So it's a bit like an archery in terms of the goods in, the goods out, the storage. If none of that's moving, the business is stuck. And we've seen that.
Yeah. I will say this. I was in the automotive supply chain for a long time, and I would not attend a logistics meeting. And one of the reasons I wouldn't is because it was 5% of revenue. So now that's a little low. A lot of times it's more like 10% of revenue. And if you're talking e-commerce, it's probably 20% of your revenue. And I think in retrospect that we didn't really feel like we had flexibility with our logistics. So when I got something shipped from China, we never once thought it can go somewhere other than LA or Long Beach. Now we go, Okay, I have a logistics team that is around me, and they are looking and seeing which port is the best one. Should this actually be air freighted over here? If it's electronics, yes. If it's pharma, yes. The world has changed a lot in terms of expectations for the supply chains. In the past, if something was a week late coming from Europe or 2 weeks late coming from China, that was just how it was. And we kept way too much inventory back in the olden days. And so we didn't worry about it. Right? And that's not possible anymore. We're trying to be lean. Carrying extra inventory costs for some businesses is an enormous expense that we can't afford anymore.
No, hugely risky. And interesting one through the COVID years was the complexity of supply chains and going a little bit deeper. So up to that point, as you said, Joe, companies just thought about this is our existing route in, this is how it goes. But when COVID, we all had to sit down. I remember I was working with a distribution business, and we're actually looking at train routes through China, Russia into Europe. And then is there an African version where we get it lower in Africa, the port and up? All of this brought it to the next level of understanding of connectivity.
Yep. And we'll get into some details on this in a minute. But my sense is that regardless of what supply chain you're in, whether we're going to talk a lot about pharma and healthcare today, but we'll also talk about some others, I'm sure. The bar is just higher and higher. The compliance goals are higher. The customer expectations are higher. We are all customers. So we all know this. When we order something, I expect it to be on my porch yesterday. I wanted them to know that I needed this. and I get this sense that in the past, the supply chain, it is what it is. Things are sometimes late. It's 2 weeks late. So what? Now the very best companies are able to provide that same day, next day experience. And it ain't going anywhere. It's the benchmark that we all must meet.
Yeah, for sure. I live near New York City, and if it's not available in 24 hours, it's a question mark.
Right. Michael, tell us a little bit about you. Where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to school? Some career highlights before you joined Efficio, and then why did you join Efficio?
So background is, I guess your listeners can guess that I'm originally from Ireland, so the border region. So Ireland is split into Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom, and the Republic of Ireland. I come from just the border. I grew up during the Troubles, so it's a conflict between the British and the Irish for 30, 35, 40 years. So lots of stories that you and I should have a beer over sometime, right, to go a little bit deeper. But it gives resilience and an open mindset in terms of the globe. Favorite, I love playing soccer, still do. I'm getting into the old age now, but I still play soccer to keep fit and healthy and enjoy myself doing that. School-wise, economics was my favorite subject at school. And then I went and did that at college because of the complexity and interconnectivity of economics. You look at what is the price of coffee? How is the pricing of a coffee at Starbucks determined? So the coffee and the water is quite low cost, but it's the consumer preference which puts it up on the brand. So economics is really practical for me. Then in between my bachelor's and master's, I did a year working for the Irish Dairy Board, which is called Ornura now. So in America, you probably know that the Dairy Board butter brand. I moved cheese around as a supply chain
Oh,
coordinator.
you're saying dairy. Okay,
Dairy.
I was thinking you meant like dairy products. You mean the county?
No, the dairy products. So cheese and butter. So cheese, for example, is quite interesting, is a live product once you make it. And it matures. So you move it slowly across the supply chain. So it's like jelly at the start. And then you move it slowly closer to the end customer, which could be 2 years after production too. So that was when I did that, that really piqued my interest in supply chain management away from economics. And then I did a master's degree in it. And then after my master's, I moved into food sourcing. So like buying salmon from the Scottish Highlands, prawns from Honduras, global supply chains, fresh food, flowers from Africa, cut them 24 hours, they're in the store. So that role after my master's really gave me that global view. And then I worked for Procter & Gamble in Switzerland. And then I had a telematics startup we might talk about later on. And then I was a sort of glutton for punishment. I went and did my PhD then on organizations implementing Lean Six Sigma programs across locations. So just say you and I, Joe, work in the same company. You improve operations in Chicago. I'm in Dublin, and you want the improvements to happen in Dublin, but they don't. So that was like the exam question. Why do things not happen at different locations? And that kind of boils down to the people you have, the systems and ways of working, and actual locational factors. So create like a diagnostic, which has guided my consultancy career ever since.
So when and why did you join Efficio?
Yeah, so I moved to the US 7 years ago after Brexit, the UK leaving the European Union. And I came here. And when you come to America, the first thing you hit you, even though I've been here on business trips before, when you move here, the scale of the place is immense. It just like rolling into New York City, or it's just huge. But to get into the big opportunities, you need to be with the best. So that's why I joined Efficio, is to get the bigger opportunities, the bigger strategic programs. And really, look, I'm a specialist in procurement supply chain. That's been my career, and I haven't changed. That's what it's been about. So it makes sense being with the best company at it.
So I have two questions for you. You've been here 7 years. What do you miss about Ireland besides the family and friends?
Two things: weather and food. So believe it or not, I'm not a sun worshiper. I don't
Yeah,
like
I'm
hot and
just going to say
humid.
people can constantly complain about the Irish weather, but you don't like the sun.
No, I don't burn too well. But the weather isn't. But it's whatever you're conditioned to and whatever you grow up with, and then the food. So there is different foods every country you go to. So Irish bread, beer does taste better in Ireland. Guinness doesn't stop. So,
That's the ultimate supply chain problem, is that Guinness only tastes like Guinness in Ireland.
do you know the reason I think is it's the last mile or the last yard of actually making the thing. So it's not so much the production process and the movement, it's when the customer gets the pint pulled in the bar and given to them. That part is a real big part of the quality process. So if you go in Dublin, you see there is a process to it, but it's hard to move that process.
So you miss the food and you miss the weather because you're not accustomed to that hot New York sun that's coming out right now.
Yeah.
And so what surprised you about the United States? I'm sure you knew a little bit of that about the United States before you moved here. What was the most surprising part?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things. One, in sort of like the positive attitude. So it's a bit corny when you come here. Americans are positive, but it is infectious when you do come. And being Irish, we always tend to downbeat achievements. So maybe you have an Irish background, Joe. So you imagine that for your
Oh,
mother
yeah.
and your father. So you downplay success and just be humble about it. But when you come here, everybody's a salesperson. So that was like a bit of a learning curve. To sell and promote is a positive back at home that could lead to an argument or a fight. So there's slightly the cultural difference was a big switch. So yeah, things can happen. Big positive place. Transactional will be the other one, cultural. So we have clients across Asia, Europe, and North America, and Middle East as well. And across the globe, there's a different approach to business transactions. So in Ireland, you and I would meet and we'd spend 50 minutes talking about anything but business, and then 10 minutes on business, maybe. But we get on really well, and then we're going to do business together. In America, the meeting is 15 minutes and you got 30 seconds to hit the rubber on the road and what's your number. But what happens in America is the first couple are transactional, and then over time it flips. The friendship comes, but it's very much what's your
Yeah, I
value?
didn't
Give it
realize
to
that.
me. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel strongly that I'd like to build those relationships to see if I even want to work with this person. And yeah, sometimes I feel like I'm wasting time. Oh, they're seeing me as frivolous because I want to understand more about them. And maybe I do better in Ireland.
You definitely have an Irish way.
Yeah, I told you I'm all American, but my DNA says I'm 100% Irish. All my ancestors are from there. Anyway, it's a good place to come from. So anyway, let's get into today's topic. So before we hit the record button, we were chatting for a long time, and we're talking about some of the challenges that we're seeing in procurement and supply chains, which is obviously going to impact downstream all the logistics companies that we're working with. And I think a lot of this started during COVID when we saw some brittleness, and then we had other issues. We've seen a war in Europe for the first time in a long time, seen war in the Middle East, which we're hoping goes away. But we've also seen in recent years challenges with the Panama Canal, the drought. We had the Houthi rebels preventing traffic in the Suez Canal, Red Sea. And this was a little daunting. And I will say in the United States in particular, the logistics space has been a little slow. So a lot of the people listening to my podcast are struggling to keep things going in, and I'll throw one other thing in under the pile. The customer expectations keep getting higher. Buy more technology, give me more of a customer experience. In the past, it would be get me a truck. And now it's get me a truck, provide me with technology, give me analytics, bring me a consulting team. How are you using AI? And meanwhile, the logistics providers are saying, it's been a little slow. And the margins are down. How am I going to make these investments? So it feels like the world's expecting so much more, but the money that's flowing through the system doesn't feel like it's so much more.
No, it's a super difficult environment to make profits. So organizations need to be really lean in how they run their operations. But just a one point to lead in there. So you talk a lot of the global disruptions, but even close to home here, say in Baltimore, we had the bridge accident. So even without big global politics, there can be disruptions near term. And even and you Midwest, Joe, I'm on the East Coast. A regular one for me is like flight disruptions. So when you have tight supply chains and you can't use the air, that's an issue. Or even one time last year, I had a client in St. Louis and I went to visit them and I heard a siren in the hotel during the night and I never heard it before and I thought it was just a fire alarm. So I got up in the morning and it was a tornado siren. And then I looked at the TV screens in the breakfast area and it showed a warehouse like 10 miles up the road where the twister went through the middle of it. And it actually cut it. It cut it through the middle and I was gone. I was sleeping in my bed during that. So disruption is a given. It always happens. Do you know what's going to happen, when it's going to happen? Definitely not. We talked earlier, Joe, about the pandemic was about resilience. But for me, supply chains have always been and always will be about agility. So there is a standard way of working, but your adaptability is a crucial factor, whether you survive or not.
Yep. Yep. So I wrote down 3 things that we wanted to talk about. And the first thing I want to talk to you about is, and I know we'll give this a little bit of a pharma and healthcare flavor because I know that's what you're working in quite a bit right now. And I said to you in my skimming across the news perspective, it seems as if pharma is one of those things that was during the COVID, we started saying, and especially now with the new administration in the United States saying, we want some of these supply chains to come home. And I was under the assumption a lot of the base materials for pharma, the base chemicals were coming from China, and I didn't know where they necessarily were put together. Give us a sense for where pharma is made right now. And then we'll talk about where it's going to be made in the future.
Yep, sure. So pharmaceuticals is an extremely complex global category. So just in a very simplistic way, there's 2 broad ways you can look at in terms of value versus volume. So 80% of the value will come from the blockbuster branded drugs. So they tend to be produced in North America, Western Europe, Ireland, a key hub, and Switzerland, a key hub. So they're the ones that pharmaceutical companies have put huge investment in over multiple years, taking the bet on them, and then they get patent protection over a number of years and they recoup that with higher pricing. So that's the branded ones, Western Europe or North America. And then there's the generic. So what happens when a drug gets past this patent? They call it the patent cliff. When it comes off that, competition floods.
I call it the patent cliff over here.
Oh. Fair enough. So when it comes off, patent, it opens up competition. So a lot more suppliers rush in to take away the profits. And that means that the manufacturing cost base in Ireland, Switzerland, and the United States doesn't make financial sense because you got China and India come in, lower cost base, lower building cost. And that creates the generic market tends to be 80% of the value roughly for 20% of the cost. So if we talk about jobs and that the jobs are in the generics, the sort of, if you go in, and we talked, Joe, about a factory I was in recently, and it was fully loaded with high-end engineering and a small amount of people. So
yes, that's going to be that is already how pharma is, high capital investment in the automation and in very exacting equipment. It's not a whole bunch of guys mixing in a big vat. So getting back to it, you said that 20% of the drugs provide 80% of the value or 80% of the profits. And that stuff's going to be in Ireland, Switzerland, United States. And that those are going to be the blockbuster drugs. That's where the big bucks is for the pharmaceutical. But as soon as it goes on to the generic list, no longer covered by a patent, it's almost certainly going to be done in China or in India, some lower cost country. Do you anticipate those supply chains moving?
Some of them for sure. And there has been steps in recent years. The COVID was a good trigger for this. So not so much the last 3 months, but 5, 6 years ago, companies sought to modulate their supply chains and look at alternative ways to guarantee market access. So the interesting development here is it's not so much the US companies have always been really global, but the companies in China and India have started to look for investments in North America before the Trump administration came in for the last couple of years in terms of one, getting market access, and then two, building out their capabilities. So what we found over the years, and you've seen this, Joe, in the automotive sector, semiconductors is the same. When you find companies start in the early stage of a production process, the sort of basic is the wrong word, but the less high skilled, they develop the foundations and get up to the more strategic ones. And that the Indian companies, there's a few of them on the East Coast here.
They're moving up the supply chain value, or the value chain, I guess we'll almost call it. So rather than just making the metal brackets, they now want to make systems that let them charge more and make more.
Yeah, Tesla is a great example. There's the big Chinese company that's leading the charge for electric vehicles. It's starting to overtake volume basis from Tesla.
Yeah, I've always thought it makes sense for China to be into electric vehicles. If there was, God forbid, a war, they can be cut off from their oil supplies fairly easily. We don't worry as much about that here. But also, I've spent a lot of time in China, and it's like working in a coal mine. I don't mean to be gross, but you're blowing your nose and thinking, where have I been today that I would have soot in my nose? So it makes sense. Anyway, one other thing I want to ask you about. When in the United States, we're always complaining about the cost of pharmaceuticals. And I know the government always says they're going to negotiate with the pharmaceutical companies. And I always hear these, I'm close to Canada, people in Canada pay less for the same drug as we pay a lot more over here. Why is that?
That's a very big, complex area. So I'll give you a little flavor on the different dynamics at place there. So the US does negotiate with the pharmaceutical companies. It has various buying groups where they get better pricing. It's not just there's one price. There is different pricing, and there is like that cooperative buying group. There's a couple of good examples for community health hospitals I've seen work. The other piece then is around the insurance system is slightly different or massively different than what happens in Canada or Northern Western Europe. So the NHS buying off the pharma is different than a health system with 5 hospitals buying off the insurance company and managing that. So it's a little bit hard to do pure apples versus apples comparison. And then the other thing that's in the mix here is also accounting policies. So there was a recent article in The Economist, and it talked about Ireland and how US pharmaceutical companies, are all global ones, move their intellectual property to their subsidiaries. And then it's an accounting rule. So it's not so much the drug pricing, it's the movement of the profit. And that's beyond my expertise. But it's not as simple. Canada pays 100 and America pays 120. There's a whole plethora of.
No, I know. It's complex. When you get a PhD who can't explain it easily, that tells you it's not an easy problem to solve. I will suggest this. The cost of drugs overall goes down on a regular basis. I've been sick, gone to my local, I go to Meijer. It's a grocery store chain. I get certain antibiotics. I go, oh, it's just free. It's free because you're a shopper here. And I was like, 20 years ago, that would have been a very expensive drug. So now it's generic. What's expensive is the blockbuster new drugs, but those are the ones we want. And I think right now we see a lot of people saying, I want to use those GLP-1s to lose weight. And I think that is just the beginning. I think there's a whole bunch of similar drugs in the pipeline, and they're going to change the world, but it's going to be expensive for a while.
You make a great point here, Joe, in terms of the US tends to get the new thing first. So if you want to get the best new car, there's usually a bit of a premium on it because it's first to market and have to get scale. So that is the positive in the US. The best of the best, you'll get it here first.
Yep. So anyway, what do you see happening with these supply chains? So we are the ones that are speaks first about the stuff that's still on patent. Is those supply chains are going to be stay the same, or what changes do you anticipate?
So for them ones there, we don't anticipate any dramatic changes because we talked earlier on about the sunk investments to build a facility and the capital payment over 5, 10, 15 years for certain manufacturing plant. And also the other key aspect is the actual skill and capability of the people clustered around. So what you find is the west coast of Ireland, so your family Joe's from Kerry, just up the road a little bit is Botox. Botox is in Mayo. So 80+% of Botox comes out of a factory over there. But what you find with that there, that's a like relatively rural location, but there's a cluster of capability and suppliers around that facility. So tomorrow morning we moved that and we put it into St. Louis. You don't have the cluster of skills, you don't have the cluster of suppliers.
It's a lot more than just opening the facility because the production equipment's probably difficult to get. It's very specialized. And then we're going to have to talk about workforce development. We're going to have to maybe talk about infrastructure. We're going to have to get the tax credits if that's applicable. The factory itself is probably the easy part.
It is. It is. It's the skills. It's the skills are really hard to get, especially high-end manufacturing.
Yep. And I will say, it's not just when I was in automotive, we just called it automotive. No one said anything else. I worked, and I remember one time a recruiter calling me and saying, oh, wanted me to go to some company. He said, they just need a good supply chain guy like you to help straighten things out. I was like, okay. And I was thinking, I'm an engineer. I don't know what they keep saying supply chain, but they kept saying supply chain to me and I was not following. And then I called a friend of mine who was a recruiter and I said, what is a supply chain? He goes, you're in a supply chain. But we didn't call it that. But I now think procurement and supply chain is now a profession that we're all seeing and recognizing. And I think logistics is within that. We didn't used to see that as a critical resource. I think that is a critical resource for opening these new facilities around the country also.
Yeah. So just my own personal story on supply chain. So I did my first job after college. I was in a supply chain role. Then I said do a master's degree in it. And then I went to look for work. And actually finding a role in supply chain was quite difficult. And that was back in 2003. It was only the big corporates that did it so even since then, it's come on understanding of what it actually is.
Yeah, there's where I'm at in Michigan. We have always had Michigan State, and they had a purchasing and logistics degree up at Michigan State. If you ever work in automotive, you'll see there's the purchasing department, but they have supplier development, they have supplier quality, they have long-term planning. It's not just we buy bolts. No, you're buying very strategic stuff. And sometimes I would replace the supply chain role is the manufacturing role. So you say, we're no longer making that ourselves. We're outsourcing it to another country or another company. And that's where the supply chain team comes in. So when somebody says, yeah, we need manufacturing, if you need manufacturing, you probably also need a supply chain team.
Yeah, one of the key concepts from early in my career when I worked at Procter and Gamble was best total value. So that's what they taught us was it's not about the logistics end or the manufacturing, it's the whole company. What is the best total value of this link or linkages? And when you look at it, then that is supply chain, which is factors in, factors out, and the speed in between.
Yep.
That's what it's about.
Yeah, I always remember always having to do the math on early projects where you say, okay, if we get it in China, it's the lowest price, but the logistics is high. If we make it here in the United States, its price is higher, but the logistics is cheaper. If we make it in Mexico, it's cheaper, but the logistics cost is a little higher. So we were always playing that game. So you don't anticipate the patent drugs, the blockbusters, those are still going to be made here. Do you anticipate any changes because of the tariffs with the drugs overseas? Do you anticipate companies will be moving stuff back here or to Europe? What's your crystal ball say?
Yeah, we've actually seen some of it starting now. We're actually companies looking at it, but it's a timing decision and getting the capital, the working capital to do the move, as it were. So companies are doing it. The ones that are thinking about it are more so the ones with international operations who want to establish a footprint here. They are the ones more likely than the US ones who are already here. They're looking more at the big growth markets, which are India and China, population wise, middle class growth, huge opportunities, medium term, next 10, 20, 30 years.
That's a whole nother point, which is, yeah, if you're selling it to the US, it might make sense to make it here. But if it's not being sold to the US, you don't necessarily have to make it here. Yeah, it's going to be interesting. And again, I've said this on my podcast previously that I thought we'd be moving pharma stuff back here. But to your point, I didn't realize we were already doing a big part of the blockbusters are already either in Western Europe or here, which I think is not going to change.
Not radically in the near term. I can't see it.
Yep. So next thing I wanted to talk to you about is you guys work with a lot of private equity companies. And before we hit the record button, you were educating me on this. So one thing I've seen, and maybe you can go into a little detail on this, is a private equity company will buy, I think if they call it a platform company, and then they'll buy that. It might be a little larger than some of their next purchases. And so in the logistics space, I buy a top logistics company and then I add on smaller ones. And we saw that with XPO. But talk about that process and how you guys work in that process. And I think we could talk about whatever industry, it doesn't really matter. Talk about that process, how you guys are looking at that world, how the private equity guys are looking at that world.
Yeah, so we're very strong linkages across pretty much all of the private equity groups globally. So there's two aspects here. One is the optimization play, which relates to cost, and two is the growth, the platform where they're going to bring the business. So our teams, and I've been involved in these ones, did a lot of work across the health sector, so health clinics, med tech. So I'm into the pharmaceutical space as well. So what we see on the optimization piece, what you have here is the click and collect model, whereby in the US is a massive geography and it's also a huge market. So what you find across the country is there's clusters of companies or providers in an area. So just say you went for eye care, there might be a cluster in Florida. There's one in the Midwest. There's one on the West Coast, East Coast. You buy the four of them together, you got a national provider. And then the synergies across that in terms of buying better, in terms of bulk, buying smarter in terms of the customer journey. And then also what to do is, and that optimization piece is trying to click together the customer journey. So for example, early in our sort of health lifespan, there might be early touch points with a doctor or an optician or any specialist provider. And then as it goes along that journey, it could end up in a surgery. The best ones we've seen with private equity is they've clicked that journey together. So the patient record, the patient engagement, the data all around that becomes more visible and the outcomes tend to be better. So that's the customer benefit. On the cost side, when you put that together, you create the synergies and you get more from less. So that's on the cost side. On the platform side, it does accelerate growth because what you get the best from multiple entities. Is it easy to do? Definitely not. So our role when you come into these scenarios is, number one, create transparency. So just say you and I were private equity, we bought up 4 regional players, you put them together to one. The first thing is they're probably on different systems. They don't have transparency on the suppliers. They might be using the same suppliers at different pricing. So we get that sort of big data approach, pull it all together, look for duplication, look at pricing, where is the synergies, then go to market, use the market to optimize.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I've thought about this a lot. At one time in the United States, we had very local supply chains. We'll talk about food, better yet, we'll talk about beer. So every city had their own brewery that was their dominant. And some place like Milwaukee had 2 or 3 that were big breweries. Here in Michigan, we had Stroh's. Every major city had a beer that they were known by. And then at some point there was this consolidation where they started buying up brands. And I always say the CPGs that you've worked for, the CPGs started saying, we have a portfolio of beers. And at some point they said, we can have Stroh's distributed nationwide. It used to just be in the Midwest. And now we have this nostalgia for these old brands where you go, oh, this has been made in Detroit for the last 80 years. And what I noticed about the beer business is as soon as it completely consolidated to the point where you go, there's 3 beer companies in the world, everybody said, I want to buy from a local brewery.
Yeah, yeah. And that's IPAs.
Yeah, and I want to bring my big growler and go fill it up like I'm in 1910. And I think we see that over and over again. We say, together, we got Ambev that seems to own 80 brands. I may be exaggerating, but it seems like they own. But the key to that business, or one of the keys, is distribution. So if you and I owned a little brewery and we said we're killing it here in the Midwest and the Northeast, but somebody brings us a big pot of money and says, global distribution, we're going to say, oh God, we'd like to keep our humble roots, but that global distribution sounds very nice.
Walmart's the sort of the role model in this way, that scale, distribution, and the cost in as well gets that lower price.
Yeah, we've gotten used to it. And by the way, I looked up the other day what percentage of goods in cost or at Walmart is from China, and I think it's 60 some percent. Looked up Costco, it's 30 some percent. When I said 60% from China, I think it's 60% from outside the US, not all from China. But it's interesting because even before we've had the current administration, they've been weaning themselves off of China.
Yeah, yeah.
I've said this before on my podcast. At one time, Walmart was 10% of China's GDP. And the good news about that is they brought 500 million people out of poverty. And you could look at Walmart and say, you're responsible for 10% of that. 50 million people came out of poverty in that relationship. So not all bad here. I always joke that we're frenemies with those guys. But anyway, getting back to it, when you come in and you're working with these private equity guys, sometimes they're consolidating industry. Other times you're seeing it go the customer journey. So I want to own the entire customer journey. I don't want to own just the local doctor. I want to also own the surgery center. I want to own the hospitals. I want to own the rehab. I want to own the entire system. Talk about what you guys are doing in those situations.
Yeah, so after the foundational stone of the transparency, what we then do is work with the stakeholders, identify near-term and medium-term opportunities. So for us, in all them situations with private equity, the key term is value creation or rapid value creation. How fast can you make an impact? So that's our sort of sweet spot, is speed to value. So what we do is we go look for the core categories. Where is the complexity? Where's the opportunity based on our benchmarking and experience? And then we run RFPs and do our professional negotiations and bring the client along with us in terms of getting the right partner for the best total value.
Yep. So I want to talk about the impact that you guys have a very high level view of the world. You're working with the private equity guys that are transforming the landscape. What do you look at when you look at the logistics space? First off, what is the expectations that I want to talk about, what you think is going to happen with our industry? But what are the expectations coming from the supply chains now?
Speed is number one. So speed of turnaround. I remember way back in the day, Joe, my second job. I remember I was managing 7 warehouses for a food company in England, and it was like the way it works there is a promotional cycle of 5 weeks. So you have to get the stock in, and Saturday is the big sales day. So Friday you have to have your inventory in. And back then, it used to be a conversation between my boss talking to his boss to ring the owner of the company to try to speed it, get it in quicker that night. So that was the old school way of relationships. Now it's very much platform and data driven, whereby companies expect visibility of their supply chains. Where are the nodes? Where is the blockages? And what are options to speed it up? So it's back to this sort of the Amazon package coming to my door. Everybody can track it, or FedEx. So I get a text here to say FedEx, this is where it is right now, your package. And it flew in from China, but it's at this airport and it's going to go to this distribution center. So that's become the expectation. The challenge for the logistics industry is it tended to be over time more like a small business. So to get that sort of platform or transparency, it takes an investment. So we find a consolidation and they're moving towards either a platform, joining a platform, being part of that, or being merged into a bigger entity.
Yeah, I think we've seen a lot of consolidation happening. We've talked about that for a long time in the industry. I just talked to Seth Clevenger from Transport Topics about the top 100 logistics companies. Some mergers and acquisitions over the last in that top 100, but not as much as I expected to see. I think that'll change under the Trump administration, which is more friendly to that type of behavior. But we have a ton of companies in the trucking space that is the backbone of the industry. We have tons of 25,000 freight brokers. 3,000, 3,500 are big. The other 22,000 are relatively small. And again, they're somewhat the backbone of the industry. I think we're going to see consolidation across both of those. But I think also, I can say this, I worked as a draftsman back in the olden days, a designer, automotive designer on the CAD system. Well, I did it on the drafting board, then I did it on the CAD systems. That job all but disappeared. And it became the technology was able to do that job. We were very high paid technicians. When I took a job as an engineer right after that, I was afraid I'd have to take a pay cut because we were paid so well. I could see the same thing happening to freight brokers. And I don't think it'll happen quickly, but I think it will happen when we'll see a few platforms that become dominant. And then all of a sudden it's, why am I paying you 12%, 13, 14% to get me a truck?
That's always the challenge with like technology and adoption. So if you think about like route optimization, back in the day, 20 plus years ago, pen and paper, brain power, and now it's a couple of clicks. You drop the data in and you got different routes and different options really quickly. So
yeah, I think also I want to talk to you about this is we have a new administration, and last go round we had Biden and the Biden administration very interested in sustainability. The Trump administration less interested. I have to say this all the time. We were pulling away from China for the last 20 years. It doesn't matter who the president is. That doesn't matter. And I think sustainability is the same thing. The top companies are still asking us to be sustainable. And I said this to you before we hit the record button. Being sustainable when you sell, like Starbucks can say, we're green. Yeah, but you're selling expensive coffee that doesn't cost you very much. You have very high margins. This business doesn't have high margins. So I think route optimization, that saves us money, helps us make more money. Getting more fuel efficient vehicles, that helps us make more money. Anything that can reduce our cost and help the environment is what we're going to pursue first. I don't think we're going to see a whole bunch of companies saying, oh, we cost us a little extra, but we're clean and green. What are your thoughts on that, Michael?
yeah, no, so when I was at Procter & Gamble, it was very early conversation around sustainability, and I looked into sustainable plastics. So it was called PLA, and I worked with the R&D guys, and it was like 6 times the cost of the current. So it got shelved, but the concept was there. How can we do things better? But for me, sustainability is always has a link to cost. So the cost to serve and the cost to buy. So if you think about the cost to serve or the customer, and we talked about this before a podcast show, is like high CO2 emissions is poorly maintained trucks and trailers. Erratic driving, bad driving burns out more fuel. You're creating excess emissions that you don't need. Out of zone driving, putting more miles on the clock that you don't need. So being better is better for the environment and lowers costs for the business as well. And then also, and sustainability, something to think about is in terms of that agility and the ways to adapt is something to think about. So what you find across lots of industries where people get stuck in the old ways, technology can jump and leap past them extremely quickly. So sustainability for me is one, there's always a cost element on it. Done right, there's always a cost element. And then two, you're on the cusp of new ideas. So that's why it's important. Like, just if you think road haulage, I've seen like Marks and Spencers in the UK, they were early adopters of this sort of aerodynamic fleet, and they looked like spaceships, but they were optimizing the flow to reduce fuel burn way ahead of the time. So them sorts of things can't be bad for a company to just to get in the mindset of there's other ways to think and what should we do next. Keep that agility piece. That's how you get it, being open.
I always say when I was still in the logistics space, still doing the day-to-day job, I would always say I want a real simple KPI. So on-time performance for all my carriers, right? I want some sort of damage assessment. Now, obviously, it's 99% plus should be not undamaged. I always like to measure billing accuracy. I hate bills that are inaccurate. It's just costs time and money. And then what am I missing here? Some sort of cost element, right? I need to know what the cost is. And I always say this, add a fifth one, and that KPI can be something that manages some sort of sustainability. And I'm not so sure what the right thing is, but I do know this. We can say definitively, this truck is what it's getting miles per gallon. And I know another truck is getting this miles per gallon. Measuring and then you take just a baseline, say, here's what we believe the emissions is for this miles per gallon. Here's what we believe for this miles per gallon. I always say this, directionally correct is good enough in the beginning. You want that to improve over time. I know you've worked in the past with technology that measures this type of thing. We're going to have that, but you can't add a sustainability slide at the last minute when you're going to see a company that wants you to have it. You can't fake it.
Yeah, no, you have to believe what you're doing for sure.
And I'm drawing a blank right now on the government organization that is all the logistics company are joining. It's a kind of a private public organization. Everybody's working with it. But anyway, you got to join those type of organizations. It's free. Get started, because the best companies out there have goals. The biggest companies have goals, and they're going to expect you to help them reach their goals. Again, I don't believe the right thing right now for most logistics and trucking companies is going to be like, oh yeah, we'll give up some profit, because there's no profit to give up right now. Unless somebody's willing to pay you a premium for it. And I know there are going to be companies that do that. We might find that at the port of LA and Long Beach, where you say it's just a cost of doing business that we had to get a different type of vehicle. Yeah. It reminds me, years ago, a friend of mine we were at a consulting company, and I was exposed to this opportunity. I said, I can't do this one, but my friend could. And it was a company that did scrap, and they had tons of scrap. They have their own trucks. No one wants to pick up and deliver at scrap yards, flat tires. And he said, their first thing is they kept saying, all of our trucks are paid for. And he says, yeah, but they're old. And the cost is in the extra gas you're paying for every week. And he said, he did the math and showed them, and he said, we don't want that payment. He says, you're paying it in gas this week. You have all these old vehicles that are not fuel efficient. And he said, they didn't want to hear it. And he kept saying, they're saying, our trucks are paid for. Why are you asking us to pay? They're paid for, but they're costing you more every week than a brand new one would, even when you throw the payment in. Anyway, yeah, I think the expectations are still there. There's certain things that aren't changing in our world. Supply chains repositioning, especially out of China, that's not changing regardless of administration. Sustainability is not changing regardless of administration. The best companies, many of the largest companies in America have that on their list. Any company in Europe has it.
Yeah, so I'll just maybe conclude, like, agility and innovation, when you focus on them and keep your eye open, the business will get stronger. So that's the key thing for anything that comes up going forward.
I love it. Michael, what I'll do is I'll make sure I put a link to your LinkedIn profile, link to your website. Any other links you and your marketing team give me, I will put those in the show notes so people can reach out and talk to you. I want to wrap this up in just a minute, but first, one more time, Who do you guys work with?
Yeah, so we work with private equity across all the pieces, North America, Europe, Middle East, and now we're into Asia, big corporations, and also the public sector. So we're quite broad based. Our expertise is procurement and supply chain. So that's what we solely focus on, and we're the biggest specialist provider in the world.
And you have offices around the world?
Yeah, so like in North America, we have New York, where I'm based out of Chicago, Mexico City, Europe, where most of the countries, and then the Middle East, we got like 4 offices, quite big. And then we're opening up in Asia as well. So,
Well, I guess the nature of our supply chains is global. So you guys are global, which is, yeah, it's an interesting time. I guess but that means there's opportunity, right?
oh, there is for sure. So I had a chat with another guy a few weeks ago, and I said to him, like, I'm more of a glass half full. So when it comes to supply chain, the given is it's going to change. That's a fact. It's how you react and when your mindset when it reacts is what matters. So that's what I was saying about openness to new ideas, exploring the environment, keeping the scanning of what could happen. And then the important thing is not be too rigid in your thinking. So if you say this is the only way we can do it, let that client you to, then something will change and then you can't react and then you're in trouble.
Yeah. And like I've said this a few times lately on my podcast, is sometimes the innovation is between the boulders where you see, hey, here's manufacturing, here's supply chain, and there's a little space in between that is a challenge, and we're gonna jump on that. And I think we're seeing that a lot in the logistics space. We're seeing transportation management systems was the silver bullet 10, 15 years ago. I thought this is it. This is all you ever need. This is the solution. And now we're seeing, I call them the killer apps, pricing apps, visibility apps. Everybody has an API that connects to your TMS, and you go, that's just brilliant. That's not the end, though. It's the next thing. I think it's Project 44 is working on some stuff that we're all hearing about. I think there's going to be, I'm a I'm like you, I'm a lean guy. I think from order to cash. I would not be surprised if we see all of the WMS, the TMS, everything, ERP, one system, order to cash. So we're celebrating where we're at. I think it's just the beginning. I would not be surprised at all if the term TMS and WMS and ERP faded away. Not the work will always be there, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's a platform that is bigger and empowered by AI.
Oh, for sure. Working a lot on AI, and there's a lot of cool things happening in the background and clients also. So I think, Joe, that's going to be the link to our next conversation, whenever that.
Exactly. I don't have you all day. Anyway, I'm talking to my friend, Michael Needham, and we're talking about supply chain reset, overcoming pharma and healthcare supply chain challenges. We also touched on some other supply chains. So we talked about a few things. So the first thing we talked about is supply chain uncertainty. Michael, a month ago when we said we were going to do this interview, everyone was talking about tariffs. I think we're still talking about tariffs. I don't think we're all as worried. I think we're going to see the United States disengage from China in a lot of cases. I think critical parts of our supply chain are going to move home. I think we didn't talk about it today, but I think anything related to critical infrastructure, electronics. You said we don't really have the critical pharma over there, so maybe that's not a concern. But I think anything that we would consider near and dear to our security is going to either move out of China to Western Europe or perhaps to North America. Next, we talked about where the value's at in the pharma space. So you said 20% of the value or the profit is happening in the newer stuff, the stuff still on patent, and that's typically made in US or Ireland or Switzerland. That's probably not going to change. The 80% that is the generic, that's the volume, but it's probably only 20% of the profit for companies. That's the stuff that's in China. Maybe that's not going to be a concern. I think going forward, we're just going to want to say that our supply chains are with safe partners, whatever that might mean. Again, my hope for the world is that China and the United States and Europe are all very friendly and do business for years to come. Next, we talk about value creation, what's happening with private equity. So we see private equity buying up a lot of companies, a lot of negativity sometimes about it. And I don't see it as typically as a negative, but one of the things we're seeing with it is sometimes they buy end to end. So they're the whole customer journey, whether think about a person from the time they're seeing their family doctor to the time they're getting rehabilitation from a surgery. You see the private equity companies want to buy that up. And somebody, Efficio, needs to come in and help them straighten that out and make sure it's efficient and cost effective. And we also talked about the platform growth. We see this a lot in logistics. XPO is a famous story. Brad Jacobs came in and just bought all sorts of logistics companies that made it into XPO and then split it up into RXO and GXO. Tremendous success story. I think we're going to see more and more of that, perhaps not by Brad Jacobs, but somebody else. Last but not least, we talked about sustainability. It doesn't matter what administration is in office, we're still going to have sustainability goals, especially if you're working in a global supply chain. You might say, oh, the company I'm working with here in the United States doesn't care. As soon as they get bought by a European company, they might care. And by the way, it's probably not even a border thing. It's maybe what their strategy is. And some certain industries are obviously more concerned about it than others. If you're a polluter that the governments of the world are chasing down, you better get interested. And I think all of us in the logistics space, we can start measuring this stuff. We've got to keep your ear to the ground, because I think in these difficult times, it's easy for logistics and transportation companies to go, I just want to survive. I don't care about lofty goals. But this is probably beyond lofty goal. This is going to be something you have to do to compete with the best. But the best companies in our space are able to meet these goals right now because they're not suffering as badly as the smaller guys. Anyway, enough of my blather. Michael, put a big old bow on this one. Final thoughts on the topic.
That's a big bow to go on the end of this. So in terms of pharmaceutical industry, healthcare industry, yeah, there is big challenges currently, but it's more business as usual. So with COVID, we were all forced to create a playbook in a really condensed, high risk environment to adapt. And so a lot of the companies brought that forward with them, and the better ones now, it's a standard way of operating. So I'd be quite positive in terms of the future of the industry. And at the end of the day, it's about patient access. So I don't think we're going to get to this stage where patients aren't getting medication, or there'll be a compromise and we'll just keep doing what we do really well.
I love it. I love it. We didn't touch on it. Maybe we can talk about this next time. I wear this Whoop. You know what a Whoop is?
I've got a
Oh, you got the
garment.
Apple one. Yeah, it's interesting because I believe before long we'll all be wearing medical wearables, and I think your doctor will call you ahead of the time before you have that stroke or the heart attack. They're going to say, Joe, I don't know what you're doing this week, but you need to get in here because something's wrong. And by the way, for anybody who wears a Whoop in the logistics space, I'm in a group called the Freight Whoop. So if you're interested, Ryan Shriver started it. There's a whole bunch of us in that group encouraging each other or competing. Not so sure which is happening. Anyway, so what conferences do you guys go to, Michael?
Yeah, we go to a lot across the different regions. So I'm more aligned to the sort of health and pharma, and that's more into the fall season. It depends on the industry, and we adapt to the market. I like to go to more specialist ones rather than the broad-based, where we do have a heavy private presence at the procurement ones, and recently in Chicago, we're at a supply chain one as well.
But very nice. I will see you guys at I'm going to one of the telematics. I'll be at the Trimble conference coming up in the fall. I'm also going to be at CSCMP, that's Council for Supply Chain Management Professionals. Let's see where else. Going to the Broker Carrier Summit in Orlando. I'm missing one here. What am I missing? Trimble. Oh, IANA. I'm going to the Intermodal Association North America out in California. Lots of conferences in the logistics space. Logistics and transportation. We got conferences coming out our ears. I feel always FOMO when I'm on LinkedIn and people are like, oh, this is the best conference ever. I'm like, I can't go to all of them. I have a day job.
There's a lot of them for sure.
Anyway, Michael, I will make sure, again, I put a link to your LinkedIn profile, link to your website, and any other links you and your marketing team give me, I will put those in the show notes so people can reach out and talk to you. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Joe. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. And thank all of you for listening to my podcast. Your support's very much appreciated. I know I always say that, but I really mean it. Until next time, onward and upward. You have been listening to the Logistics of Logistics podcast, where we engage with leaders in the logistics and supply chain community. If you like what you hear, please subscribe, hit the like button, and leave us a nice review on Apple or Spotify or wherever else you listen. Also, please check out our videos on YouTube and connect with us on LinkedIn. We're very big on LinkedIn. And you can also reach us on the logisticsoflogistics.com, our website.